The laundromat on Clement Street smelled like dryer sheets and old coffee, and on Tuesday evenings, it was always empty. Almost. Nate Calloway had been coming here for 3 years, ever since the machine in his building broke and the landlord stopped pretending he was going to fix it. 3 years of hauling a duffel bag down 2 flights of stairs, across the parking lot, past the Vietnamese restaurant that always made him hungrier than he could afford to be. 3 years of sitting in the same plastic chair, the one near the window with the crack running up the back, watching his daughter's little sock spin in circles, while he tried not to think too hard about the month ahead. His daughter's name was Ivy. She was 7 years old, and she had her mother's eyes and his stubbornness and an absolute refusal to go to sleep. Before she'd told him 3 things she'd noticed that day. Not 3 things that happened. 3 things she'd noticed. The cloud that looked like a mailbox. The way the crossing guard always whistled the same 2 notes. The spider that had built a web between the side mirror of someone's parked car and the rear view, and how the web was still there even after it rained. Ivy noticed everything. Nate had been raising her alone for 4 years now. Since her mother left for Portland with a man she'd met at a conference and a plan she'd been building quietly for longer than Nate had realized. He didn't hate her for it. He'd tried for a while because it seemed like the right reaction. But the hate never really held. What held was the laundry and the school pickups and the grocery lists calculated to the dollar, and the way Ivy still sometimes reached for his hand in the cereal aisle like she was afraid of losing him in a crowd. He worked dispatch for a delivery company. 12 hours on, 2 days off, every week the same rotation. It paid enough to keep them housed and fed, mostly, as long as nothing broke down and nothing unexpected happened. And the universe behaved itself, which it did not always do. This particular Tuesday the universe had not behaved. The car needed a belt replacement. The mechanic had called at noon. Nate had done the math 3 times on his phone's calculator app, the same way he always did when the numbers didn't change, no matter how many times he ran them. As if repetition might eventually produce a different result. It hadn't. After rent, after the car, after Ivy's field trip fee he'd already committed to, there was almost nothing left until next Friday. He sat in the plastic chair with the cracked back. Stared at his phone and tried to think. Ivy was with his neighbor, Mrs. Okonkwo, a retired school librarian who kept butterscotch candies in a dish by the door, and asked Ivy detailed questions about her books as though she were conducting a very gentle literary review. Ivy loved her. Nate was grateful for her in the specific way. You're grateful for people who appear in your life without explanation and simply decide to be reliable. The dryer hummed. Someone had left a magazine on the bench across from him, something glossy with a celebrity on the cover, smiling the way people smile when someone is telling them to. He didn't pick it up. What he was thinking about was dinner. Not in a dramatic way. Just the quiet, logistical, slightly exhausting way he'd been thinking about dinner since about 2 in the afternoon. He had pasta at home and half a jar of marinara, and enough for Ivy. Enough for her was the math he did first always, his come second. He was still looking at his phone when the door opened. The woman who walked in was younger than him by maybe 5 or 6 years, though it was hard to tell, because she had the kind of tiredness around her eyes that doesn't come from age. It comes from not sleeping enough, from carrying things, from the particular weight of having no one to hand the bag to even for 5 minutes. She was wearing a coat that was slightly too big for her, the kind you find in the back of a closet or a donation bin, and she was carrying a laundry basket, balanced on her hip with one hand, while her other hand held tight to a small boy of maybe 5 or 6, who was walking beside her with the focused, serious expression of a child who has been told to stay close. The boy's name, Nate would learn later, was Otto. The woman's name was Deb. They took the machines on the far wall, the ones closest to the heating vent that blew warm air in a way that probably wasn't intentional but was welcome in November. Nate watched her sort laundry, with the quick efficiency of someone who didn't have time to be anything but efficient. Otto sat on the bench beside her and kicked his feet and looked around the laundromat with the calm curiosity of a child who was used to accompanying his mother on errands, who understood without being told that this was just what their evenings looked like. Nate looked back at his phone. He was almost done. His cycle had 12 minutes left when he heard it. He didn't hear it completely, at first. He heard the boy's voice, low and careful the way children are, when they've absorbed the seriousness of something without fully understanding it. And then he heard the woman's voice, equally low. And then he heard the word, nothing. And the word tomorrow. And something in his chest did something he hadn't expected. He looked up. Deb was crouching in front of Otto with one hand on his shoulder, The boy was looking at her with the kind of face children make when they're trying very hard not to be upset, when they've decided that being upset would make things worse for someone they love, and so they're holding themselves very still instead. "We'll figure it out," she was saying. "We always do." Otto nodded. He didn't say anything. He just nodded, and then he leaned forward and put his forehead against her shoulder. And she held him there for a moment with her eyes closed. And Nate looked away because it felt private. But he'd heard enough. He sat with it for a minute. Toots. His dryer beeped and he didn't move immediately. He was thinking about a night 3 winters ago when Ivy had a fever of 103, and he'd had $11 in his account, and the pharmacy was closed, and he'd sat on the bathroom floor at 2 in the morning, with a wet cloth and his daughter's head in his lap, and felt more alone than he had ever felt in his life. He was thinking about how nobody had knocked on his door that night, how nobody had known, how he'd gotten through it anyway but barely, and the barely had cost him something he was still paying back in ways he couldn't name. He got up. He folded his laundry, slowly, killing time, and then he walked to the vending machine near the back wall. He got a bag of pretzels and a juice box, the apple kind. Then he walked to the change machine and broke a 5, and then he walked back across the laundromat, and he stopped a couple feet from where Deb was sitting. "Hey," he said, keeping his voice easy. "Sorry to bother you. The vending machine gave me an extra juice box and I can't drink 2 of them. Would your son want it?" She looked up at him. She was guarded. Of course she was a strange man approaching her in a laundromat at 8 in the evening. And he understood the guardedness completely and didn't take it personally. "I'm just trying to not waste it," he added, holding it out. She looked at the juice box, and then at him, and then at Otto, who had already spotted it, and was looking at his mother with the very careful expression of a child who has learned not to ask for things. "Say thank you," she said. "Thank you," Otto said immediately. He took the juice box with both hands. He was very precise about finding the straw hole. He inserted the straw with great seriousness, and took a long drink and then looked up with the expression of someone who has just received confirmation of something wonderful. Nate smiled and went back to his chair. He sat there for another few minutes, sorting through nothing. Doing the kind of thinking that doesn't produce conclusions but has to happen anyway. He thought about the pasta at home, and the half jar of marinara. He thought about the belt on his car and Friday, and the calculator app. He thought about Otto's face, that careful stillness, the way the boy had pressed his forehead against his mother's shoulder. He thought about Ivy, who was 7 years old and noticed everything, and who he was raising as well as he could, which was sometimes well, and sometimes not quite well enough, and always with the understanding that trying mattered even when it wasn't enough. He made a decision. He went to the vending machine again. He bought the crackers and the peanut butter cups and the other juice box. Then he pulled out his wallet. He had $32 in cash, which he'd been saving to cover a copay he had scheduled for Thursday. He stood there for a moment, doing math that wasn't really math, because the numbers weren't the point. He took out 20. He folded it small, and he tucked it inside the bag of peanut butter cups, and then he walked back across the laundromat and crouched down in front of Otto. "Hey bud," he said, "can you give these to your mom?" Otto looked at the snacks with enormous eyes and took them with both hands, the same way he'd taken the juice box, very careful, like they might float away. "From the vending machine," he said. The vending machine was feeling generous tonight, Nate said. Otto considered this with great seriousness and then nodded, as though this explained everything. Nate stood up. He met Deb's eyes for just a moment. She was looking at him with an expression he recognized. Not quite gratitude yet, because she didn't know yet, just a kind of wariness softening into something else. He gave her a small nod. She gave him one back. He gathered his laundry bag. He zipped it up. He said, "Have a good night" to the room in general, the way you do when you're leaving and don't want to make it a thing, and he walked out into the November cold and started home. He was halfway down the block when he heard the door of the laundromat open behind him. He didn't turn around. He kept walking, but he heard her voice. Just 2 words, called after him, not loud, just enough to carry. "Thank you." He raised a hand without turning, kept walking. The night was cold and the street was mostly quiet, and somewhere ahead of him a bus was pulling away from a stop, its red taillights blurring in the damp air. He walked with his laundry bag over his shoulder and his hands in his pockets and something in his chest that felt different from how it had felt an hour ago. Lighter maybe? Or maybe not lighter. Maybe just less heavy, which is not the same thing but sometimes feels like it. Back in the laundromat, Deb opened the peanut butter cups. She opened them for Otto, to hand him one, and that was when the folded bill fell out onto the bench between them. She picked it up. She unfolded it slowly, and she looked at it for a long moment without saying anything, and then she put her hand over her mouth, and Otto looked at her with immediate concern. "Mom, I'm okay," she said. Her voice came out different than she intended. "I'm okay, baby." She was not okay exactly. She was crying, quietly. In the way adults cry when they're trying not to alarm their children. With a closed mouth, and still shoulders and eyes that are doing things eyes are not supposed to do in public. Otto watched her with his peanut butter cup in one hand. And his brow furrowed. Not frightened but very attentive, the way children are when they've decided that paying attention is the most useful thing they can do. "Was it the money?" he said. She laughed. It came out a little broken. "Yes, baby, it was the money." Otto looked at the door where the man had gone out. He looked back at his mother. "He was nice," he said. "He was," she said. She folded the 20 back up and held it in her hand for a moment before putting it in her pocket, carefully, like it was something that needed to be kept safe. Then she picked up Otto's peanut butter cup and handed it back to him, and she looked out through the laundromat window at the wet street outside. And she breathed. She'd been on her own with Otto for 2 years, since his father moved to another state, for reasons she'd stopped trying to summarize. She worked mornings at a dental office, and afternoons she picked Otto up from school, and they ate dinner. And did his reading homework at the kitchen table, and she got him to bed, and then she sat up for a while longer, doing the kind of math that never quite works out. She wasn't drowning. She wanted to be clear about that to herself because drowning felt dramatic and she was not the dramatic type. She was just tired. She was tired in the specific way of a person who never gets to stop, who doesn't get a shift change, who wakes up already thinking about the next thing. Tonight had been the kind of night where the tiredness was loud. She'd told Otto there was nothing for dinner when he'd asked, because she hadn't figured it out yet, and she'd seen his face do the thing it did sometimes. That careful, adult stillness, too old for a 5-year-old. And she'd hated herself a little for it. Not a lot. You couldn't afford a lot of that, but a little. And now there was $20 in her pocket, from a man she didn't know, who hadn't made a production of it, who had left before she could even respond properly. She thought about that. The leaving before she could respond. She understood it, actually. She understood it in her chest in a way she couldn't quite explain. When you helped someone and stayed to watch, you were making the help about you a little bit. This man had made it about none of them, which somehow made it about all of them. She was still thinking about it when Otto finished his peanut cup and leaned against her arm and said, "Mom, can we get food on the way home?" "Yes," she said. "We can." He looked up at her, surprised by the yes. The chicken place? She thought about the 20 in her pocket. She thought about a stranger walking home in the cold with his laundry bag. "Yeah," she said. "The chicken place." Otto pumped his fist in the small, contained way he did when something went better than expected. Then he leaned back against her arm and went back to kicking his feet, content. Outside, the rain had started again, just a light drizzle, the kind that blurs the street lights into soft gold rings on the wet pavement. Deb watched it through the window and felt, for the first time in what felt like a long time, that the evening was not entirely against her. Nate got home at 8:45. Mrs. Okonkwo was in the living room with Ivy, who had apparently decided that this evening required 3 books instead of the usual 2, and had made her case successfully because the 3rd book was open in her lap, and she was pointing at something on the page with the focused energy of a child mid-argument. "Dad," she said without looking up. "Mrs. Okonkwo thinks the owl in this book is sad because he lost something, but I think he's sad because he doesn't have anyone to talk to, which is different." Nate set his laundry bag down. "Those can both be true at the same time." Ivy considered this. "Yeah," she said slowly, "I guess they can, Mrs. Okonkwo gave Nate a look over Ivy's head, the look of someone who has been engaged in serious intellectual discussion for 90 minutes and is mildly exhausted by it in the best possible way. He mouthed thank you. She waved him off. After Mrs. Okonkwo left, Nate made pasta. He made enough for 2, which for the first time in a few days felt genuinely fine because the math had shifted slightly. Not fixed. It was never fixed. There was no fixed. There was only managed and then managed again, but shifted enough to breathe. Ivy sat at the kitchen table and drew a spider web on the back of a school flyer while he cooked. She drew it with scientific accuracy, she explained, because she'd been studying the one in Mrs. Okonkwo's windowsill. "Did you know spiders feel vibrations in their webs?" she said. "Like that's how they know something's there. They can't really see it, they just feel it." Nate stirred the marinara. "I didn't know that." "Yeah." She added another spoke to the web. "I think that's kind of like how you know when something is wrong with me before I say anything. You just feel it." He stopped stirring. He looked at the back of her head, at her hair in its slightly lopsided ponytail, at her small shoulders hunched over her drawing. And he felt something move through him that he didn't have an exact name for. It was the feeling of being known, of being seen by someone who didn't even have the vocabulary yet for what they were perceiving, who just reached for the closest metaphor and landed, somehow exactly right. "Yeah," he said, "maybe it's like that." She nodded satisfied and went back to her web. He finished the pasta and served it, and they ate at the kitchen table, while Ivy told him the 3 things she'd noticed that day. A parking meter with a tiny flower growing from a crack at its base. A man walking a dog, who was also carrying an identical dog in a tote bag, and the way the school bathroom tiles spelled out something that might be initials. If you looked at the cracks in a certain way, which she had spent most of indoor recess investigating. Nate ate his pasta and listened to all of it. When Ivy was in bed, he sat at the kitchen table for a while with a glass of water and thought about the evening. About the laundromat, and Deb, and the boy who took the juice box with both hands like it was precious. About the $20, which he could not quite afford and had given anyway, and which he did not regret even slightly. He thought about his own 3 years of plastic chairs, and spinning laundry and getting through. About the neighbor who watched Ivy and the librarian, who asked her about books, and the fact that he was still here, still managing, still making pasta at 9 o'clock with enough for 2. You are never as alone as you think you are at your lowest point. That's not a comfortable thought when you're in it. When you're in it, the aloneness is loud and specific and very convincing. But looking back, or sideways, or forward, you can sometimes see the places where someone put a hand out. Not every time, not always enough. But sometimes a juice box. Sometimes $20 in a bag of peanut butter cups. Sometimes a neighbor who keeps butterscotch candies in a dish and asks your daughter questions like let her opinions matter, which they do. You get through. And then you look for where to put your hand out. He rinsed his glass and turned off the kitchen light and went to check on Ivy, who was already asleep with one arm thrown over the edge of the bed, and her mouth slightly open. And he stood in the doorway for a moment the way parents do, just looking, just being sure. She was fine. She was fine. He pulled her door most of the way closed and went to bed, and that night he slept better than he had in a week.